A very warm welcome to everyone, and a very good evening to all of us sharing the same time zone, and obviously greetings to our participants all across the globe. So with this, I will humbly request Professor Sangeeta Menon, the head of NIA's Consciousness Studies program and also the Dean of School of Humanities, to please begin with the session. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Niharika, and namaste, all of you. Good evening. Good evening, Professor Mark McClish, and namaste, Madhuji, and namaste to all of you out there. Today is our 11th lecture of the series, and we have 3 more lectures to go. But to begin today's session also, I request Preet to take over the mic and conduct the meeting.
Thank you so much, ma'am. A very warm welcome to one and all. I would request Meera to start today's session with an invocation. Over to you, Meera.
Thank you, Preet. Today I wish to sing a very Krishna Ni Begane Yaro. It is a Kannada song. It's a very famous classical Kannada song, and it is composed by Vyasatirtha in Raga Yamuna Kalyani. So Vyasatirtha was born at Bannur in the Mysore district of Karnataka, and he's regarded as one of the foremost dialecticians in the history of Indian philosophy itself. And he belonged to the Dvaita school of Madhvacharya. He, along with Jayatirtha, helped in systematizing Dvaita into an established school of Vedic thought. And Vyasatirtha's genius lay in his clear understanding and exposition of all his opposing schools of thought, for which even his opponents admired him. And this particular song is filled with bhakti. And in this song, he's requesting Krishna with all his adornments to come as quickly as possible. So I begin now. Krishna ni begane maro, Krishna ni begane maro, begane baro, mukhavanne toro, begane baro, mukhavanne toro, Krishna begane baro, baro, Krishna begane baro, ಕಾಲೇಲಂದಿಗೆ ಗೆಜ್ಜೆ ನೀಲದ ಬಾವುಲಿ, ನೀಲ ವರ್ಣನೆ ನಾಟ್ಯ ವನದೂದ ಭಾರೋ, ಕೃಷ್ಣ ಬೇಗನೆ ಬರೋ.
Thank you so much, Meera, for that beautiful rendition of Sri Vyasatirtha on Udupi Sri Krishna, who is also the guru of Purandaradasa, who is considered to be the father of Indian classical music. It was beautiful. Thank you, Meera. And with that, we will head to today's lecture. I would request Sangeeta ma'am to introduce today's speaker. Sangeeta ma'am, over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Preet. And firstly, at the outset, a very warm welcome and namaste to Mark McClish, and both Madhuji and me are grateful to you for accepting our invitation and making your presence possible and this lecture possible. So to give a very small, brief introduction to Professor McClish, Professor McClish is the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Northwestern University. His research interests include the classical traditions of Arthaśāstra and Dharmashastra. He is particularly interested in the composition, transmission, and reception of the texts in these traditions, and what these processes can tell us about the relationship between political power and religious authority in the period. And I think it's an extremely interesting topic. And as we conceived this series, we definitely wanted to situate the topics of the series also in a sense of contemporaneity, or at least understanding certain social processes which historically hold good for many times. So once again, a very warm welcome to Professor Mark McClish, and our sincere thanks to you, sir.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to both yourself and Dr. Deshpande for this invitation. I'm both grateful and humbled to be presenting to all of you. I also want to thank Amira for that beautiful invocation at the beginning. I present today my own thoughts on the statecraft tradition and the place of the Arthaśāstra inside of it, and what that can tell us about the relationship between what we might call religion and politics, for lack of a better term, at least at the outset, in ancient India. So my talk today is planned to be around 50 or 55 minutes, and I'm hoping that will leave time for us to have some discussion about the theories and ideas that I'm putting forward today. So with that, let's begin. I'm sorry, I don't have a window treatment right now. I'm getting a lot of sun, but I think the sun will go away momentarily. I should also say I've had some trouble with my internet connection. I have a backup plan if for some reason my connection goes down. So if I freeze, just give me a moment and I'll try to go to a hotspot and make sure I can continue. Okay. All right, let's see, screen sharing. All right. Are you seeing my PowerPoint? For some reason I have trouble. Are you seeing my whole screen or just the PowerPoint?
We are seeing your whole screen.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Is that better? I need to be able to see my text as well, so I'm not sure.
Now it's full screen. Thank you.
Now it's full screen? All right, well, that's going to be a problem because I have my text here in the Word document. I'm not sure how to get them both to appear at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's gone back to the...
yeah, to the talk and the full screen? All right, give me a moment here. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm so sorry about this. I'm going to stop sharing and print this. Here we go. All right, apologies. It's printing right now, so if you'll just give me a moment. Many apologies for that. I appreciate your patience. All right. The subject of today's talk is the Arthaśāstra and the statecraft tradition in ancient India. The Arthaśāstra is a text that needs little introduction, but I will point out to those who might not be too familiar with it that the Arthaśāstra is both a masterpiece of ancient political thought in any culture and by any standard, and also a uniquely valuable source for reconstructing the history of ancient India. Simply put, we find many things in the Arthaśāstra that are simply not discussed anywhere else in our extant sources. The general reason for this, I think, is that while most of the texts that survive from this period are religious in nature and are therefore written within what we might call a priestly, theological, or philosophical imaginaire, the Arthaśāstra arises from a different tradition entirely, that of niti or statecraft. As I hope to show today, the Arthaśāstra and the early statecraft tradition saw the world in a very different way from more religious sources in the period, namely from a viewpoint that we can recognize as both amoral and, I will argue, functionally secular. This point of view is at such variance with most of what we read from classical India that it is something of a surprise that the Arthaśāstra survived at all. It is a testament, I think, to the genius of its composer, or composers as the case may be, the potency of whose vision made the Arthaśāstra one of the most influential texts of the classical period. Although Sanskrit texts on statecraft continued to be composed through the medieval and early modern periods, today I'll be exploring the emergence and efflorescence of the statecraft tradition in the classical period, which I will define very broadly, simply for the purposes of this talk, from about 600 BCE to 800 CE. What is more, I'll be looking at the niti tradition primarily through the lens provided by the Arthaśāstra. I'll start by talking a bit about niti as an expert tradition before launching into a more detailed investigation of the Arthaśāstra. For those who are not familiar with the Arthaśāstra, I will try to give you a sense of its content, style, and approach, and then present my own theory of the text's authorship and development over time. I will use this approach to highlight how I think the Arthaśāstra, particularly in its original form, conveys what I conceive of as a kind of disciplinary subjectivity endemic to the statecraft tradition, which is to say the particular way that the Arthaśāstra and texts like it trained people to see the world. This disciplinary subjectivity, with its defining focus on gaining power and finding success in the world, with its characteristic disregard for things transcendent and unseen, to moral law and divine threat, stands at odds with pious worldviews of contemporary texts like the Manusmriti and the Mahabharata. In this way, the early Arthaśāstra and its own potent way of seeing the world presented a simultaneous threat and opportunity to religious thinkers seeking to shape expectations of good kingship. I'll conclude with a reflection on how the tension between politics and piety was managed in texts of the later classical period, and finally leave us with a yet unsolved puzzle. Why was the Arthaśāstra, written so long ago, the last great work of statecraft in the classical period and beyond, in Sanskrit statecraft? What happened to the niti tradition in its wake? And with that, let's begin with a quick look at the statecraft tradition and the textual sources through which we can reconstruct its outline and history. There are a number of names found in various Sanskrit and Prakrit sources that all refer more or less to the same tradition of statecraft, and a few are given on this slide. These terms refer to a shared tradition delineated by a common body of technical concepts and practical advice aimed specifically at the practical business of running a kingdom. The name I prefer for this tradition is niti, which means leading or governing, and by extension what we might call statecraft or political science. Its more extended form is dandaniti, which means governing by means of the staff of punishment, which speaks to the conviction that the king's governing authority was ultimately or most significantly based in his right, unique among worldly denizens, to punish or to decide who may punish. Now, among these terms, one clearly refers to a slightly more capacious subject, and that is Rajadharma, the sacred law or laws for kings. Conventionally, Rajadharma exceeds the subject of niti, insofar as, in addition to comprehending practical matters of rule, it also includes the moral and ritual obligations of the king. In our most important tracts on Rajadharma from the classical period, namely the 7th through 9th chapters of the Manusmriti and the Rajadharma Parvan of the Mahabharata, there is a clear textual and disciplinary distinction between the narrow business of practical governance, which we might call niti proper, and the more capacious reflections on kingship, integrating concerns about their personal lives, particularly the religious and moral dimensions thereof. This distinction will become important later, but it is important now to note that even where niti tracts are integrated into larger discussions of kingship, such as Rajadharma, and even while niti tracts integrated some reflections on morality and spirituality, they nevertheless retain their identity as a distinctive discourse and tradition focused on practical matters of governance. Now, what we might call a greater niti tradition can be traced in different places and forms across Sanskrit literature, and I give some of these texts on this slide. Many of these texts will be well familiar to most of you, but a few, such as the Chakshuka Artha and the Chakshushiya Arthaśāstra, may not be. What we can see from this list most clearly, however, is that we have here very different kinds of texts. In addition to texts devoted exclusively to statecraft, we have also treatises on sacred law and conduct, the Epic of the Great War, a collection of fables, collections of proverbial wisdom, and digests. What is more, they teach niti in different forms, with different methods, and at different levels of expertise. How should we understand them all to be related? I propose that we can disambiguate the greater niti tradition by recognizing that it has its historical basis among experts in statecraft who isolated the world of politics as an area of inquiry and who were defined by their expertise in that subject. Once we see niti as an expert tradition, in other words, we can begin to understand more of its social history and disambiguate these different niti sources. As an expert tradition, I would argue that niti is characterized by three disciplinary features. The first is a common, if somewhat variable, set of technical terms. I've given a few of these on this slide, the most iconic and important of which would be what I've given as the second here, the seven limbs of the state, or the Saptanga theory of the state. This has a kind of paradigmatic role in nearly all niti tracts. These concepts are usually presented in enumerated sets, and our shorter sutra-like niti texts, like the Chakshushiya, appear to focus preponderantly on lists of these enumerated concepts. The second disciplinary feature, as shown on this slide, is the isolation of a specific sphere of action, namely royal governance and its engagement through a specific set of activities, namely practical techniques of rule. There is also some scope in niti texts for proverbial wisdom, somewhat removed from the enjoyment of specific material actions, but the defining emphasis of the niti tradition is on techniques of rule. And I'll talk more about this, the way that niti creates a social sphere as a place for engagement and excellence and activity. Finally, we come to the third feature of niti as an expert tradition, and this is the one that I want to spend the most time charting out later in this talk, and that is its defining disciplinary, what I'm calling disciplinary subjectivity. Education in niti not only conveys a set of technical concepts, advised courses of action, and frameworks for activity, it also generates in the student a way of seeing the world. And as I said, I will discuss each of these more in a moment. I'm sorry going so fast through slides that have so much text on them, but I will return to all of these topics. Once we recognize that niti was first and foremost a form of expertise developed and transmitted primarily among royal counselors, I'll argue, we see all the more clearly that our different extant sources convey different degrees of expertise, and that only one of our classical texts gives us a close look inside the tradition, and that text is the Arthaśāstra, as I try to convey on this slide. With the sutra-like niti texts, we have just the sutra, we lack the kind of commentary in which the sutras are explained and the kind of true genius of the tradition is communicated. But more interestingly, I think in the Dharma-shastra and in the epic context, we have very abridged niti teachings, nothing which would have been sufficient for real expertise in niti, but really serve to embed niti in larger discourses, whether those are about righteous conduct of kingship or law or something else. And then with the Panchatantra, we have certain technical aspects or principles of niti as well as gnomic wisdom embedded in story form. And the Niti Sara is, by its own admission, a literized simplification and something of a scholastic augmentation of the Arthaśāstra, but one that is clearly derivative and clearly aimed at a more kind of literate and literary audience, a more accessible version of the Arthaśāstra in some ways. So based on this, I'd like then to turn to the Arthaśāstra and use it as a focal point for an inquiry into the history of the Niti tradition more generally. From a textual perspective, the Arthaśāstra can be seen as the watershed of the Niti tradition, the culmination of earlier Niti texts and towards which they were developing, as well as the work that defined and shaped the classical Niti tradition thereafter. From an interpretive perspective, the Arthaśāstra is the text in which the inner logics of the discipline of statecraft come to be most fully realized and expressed. In its pages, we can see the emergence of a distinctively Indic form of political consciousness, and in its wake, we can see the way in which its political vision swirled the turbulent waters of politics and religious thought for decades. All right, so to provide an overview of the Arthaśāstra, we'll start with a kind of formal or structural features. It's a text of about 5,200 sutras or sentences, mainly comprising instructions to kings and their deputed agents regarding deliberation about and execution of techniques of government. As a Shastra, it consists of technical terms and taxonomies, context-specific instructions and advice, and it models deliberations between masters and teachers on different views on different topics. Now, within the text, we do find some pious claims as to the need for the king to uphold Dharma, but these are belied to a great extent by the actual approach of the text, which overwhelms these claims, that is thoroughly amoral and purely strategic, as we'll see in some examples in a moment. In scope, detail, and insight, it is a work of unrivaled political genius. In other words, what we see the composer of the Arthaśāstra doing in the text shows an incredible virtuosic ability in handling the technical terms of the Niti tradition and in using them to map out highly nuanced and sophisticated strategies in different contexts. Now, the text is composed mostly in prose sutras, but there are interspersed verses, and I'll talk about those in a moment. It's divided into 15 books, adhikaranas, and interestingly and importantly for my theory, these 15 books are what I call redundantly subdivided by two different and competing segmentation schemes. Those 15 books are divided in the first order into 180 prakaranas or topics, and at the same time, those 15 books are divided into 150 chapters or adhyayas, and I'll talk more about this in a moment. Interspersed amongst its teaching, as I said, are dialogues attributed to various teachers and to Kautilya. These citations are called apadesha in the text, and Kautilya provides the siddhanta or the uttarapaksha, the proper position at the end of the debate. Now, informally, which is to say this is not recognized anywhere in the text itself, although commentators recognize it, it has a kind of a bigger, more general structure. It's divided into two halves, the first half on domestic policy and the second half on foreign policy. These are framed by two chapters that themselves do not deal directly with statecraft, but talk about the text itself. The introductory chapter has a table of contents, and the final chapter, the Tantrayukti chapter, has technical features of the Shastra to enhance and enable study of it. And then there's something of an appendix in the 14th book, Upanishadika, which gives various spells and recipes to be used against one's enemies. It's kind of also thematically separate from the rest of the text. The 15 books of the Arthaśāstra start with the subject of the king and his training, looking at the kind of executive functions and features of the royal governance. And then it moves into Adhyakshapachara, this the longest chapter of the text, which provides instructions both on the settlement of land and the building of cities and forts, but mainly on the various procedures and regulations to be followed by the Adhyakshas, the overseers, or the superintendents that carry out the daily activities of the state. Then the third chapter is the legal code, Dharmasthya, of civil law. And then the fourth chapter, the very interesting chapter on Kantakashodhana, clearing of thorns, which deals with criminal law, but also with the remediation of other threats to the king, including, for instance, what we might call acts of God. And then there's a kind of appendectical section on secret practice, which has a number of different things in it. In the fifth book, Yoga Vritta, and one of the most interesting parts about Yoga Vritta is that it contains some of the only chapters in the Arthaśāstra that are not formally directed at the king. The last three chapters of this are instead directed at the king's ministers or at someone who's seeking an audience with the king. And it's in these chapters, I think, we really understand the composition and the audience of the Arthaśāstra. Then there is, in book 6, what I call the hinge or the chiasmus of the text, called Mandalayoni. And this is where the text presents the theory of the sevenfold state. Now, the text is not chiastic in structure. It does not have inverted parallelism like one sees in certain texts or in certain poems. But I do think it is organized around the same kind of logic where it was seen as two halves, and the central focus of the text was not the beginning of the text per se, but the place where these two halves met. And that's why we get in the 6th book all of the more theoretical reflection, including the presentation of theoretical elements like the sevenfold state and the prakritis of the mandala, the circle of kings. Then that chapter launches into the most kind of virtuosic part of the Arthaśāstra, which is the discussion of foreign policy, and then into a discussion of the subject of the relative severity of different calamities striking the state in its 7 parts. And then in chapters 9, 10, and 13, we get a kind of progression that I call the army marching to war. We have the work of the king preparing to march, And then we have in chapter 10, or book 10, the discussion of the battlefield strategy. And then in 13, after one's won the battle, then the strategy for taking the fortress, where the enemy king is kind of ensconced and trying to defend. And interspersed in there are two kind of out of place chapters, one on the practice against sanghas, or republics, oligarchies, if you will. And then a chapter on strategy of the weaker king, which is really kind of an encomium in some ways for the power of counsel over the power of might when it comes to kings finding success against one another. And then there's the 14th book, Upanishadika, which provides the magic spells and recipes, and the 15th, Tantra Yukti, as I said, which provides the technical elements of the Shastra for the purposes of study. So I wanted to give, and I won't read through all these for the sake of time, but I wanted to give a couple of larger excerpts from the text to give some sense of its kind of Shastra qualities. Here we have, from the 9th chapter of the first book, a discussion of the ideal qualities of an amatya, of someone who is a minister of the kings. These are high-ranking government officials in different roles. And we see this tendency here towards enumerated lists, the amatya sampad, the excellences of the amatya, given in the first paragraph. And in the second, it's kind of typically Arthaśāstric thinking about how one examines and finds out about the presence of these qualities. And then another kind of typically Shastric reflection on the affairs of the king. There are three kinds: the directly observed, the unobserved, and the inferred. And this provides the kind of theoretical justification for the necessity of helpers like the amatyas to carry out the king's business. One of the other features I want to highlight is there's two features present in this passage. This is a particularly juicy part of the Arthaśāstra, one that I think is particularly telling. It shows both the value of loyalty to the king, the supreme value of supreme loyalty to the king, as well as the Arthaśāstra's amoral scheming. And we have here what is called the test of righteousness, the test of dharma. And it goes like this. So the idea behind the test of dharma, this is one of 4 tests that the king uses to test the loyalty of anyone seeking high office with him. And based on how well that individual, whether the individual passes the test, that will determine the position that the rank that they're given inside the government, the role that they're given inside the king's government. So the first of these tests is the test of dharma. In cooperation with the Mantra Purohita, the counselor chaplain, after installing the ministers in regular departments or kind of generic positions, he should test their integrity with secret tests. Here's the first one. The chaplain, the Purohita, becomes indignant at being appointed to officiate at a sacrifice of a person at whose sacrifice one is forbidden to officiate or to teach such a person. Right? So this is someone who is excluded from the right to have someone as esteemed as the Brahmin Purohita officiate at their sacrifices, or to receive instruction from such an individual. So really going against the kind of the writ of Dharmashastra in particular. So when the Purohita refuses, the king dismisses him. And then behind the scenes, the Purohita sends secret messages to instigate each of these ministers and says, this king is unrighteous. Come on, let us install in his place some other righteous person, a pretender from his family, a prince in disfavor, a member of the royal household, the man who is the sole support of the kingdom, a neighboring lord, a forest chieftain, or a man who has risen to power. Everyone likes this idea. What about you? So here the Purohita is tempting this minister, saying, be righteous, do the right thing, follow sacred writ. Don't be loyal to this king who's unrighteous. But in true Arthaśāstric style, if he rebuffs this entreaty, then he passes the test. That is to say, if he is more loyal to the king than he is to Dharma, then he has passed the test of Dharma. So this shows us both the supreme value of loyalty to the king, but also the disregard with which the Arthaśāstra treats piety and other kinds of religious injunctions. And then we have here another juicy example from the Arthaśāstra, in which, and I won't read this one again, I apologize. I know you're not supposed to put up text and then not talk about it, but I've fallen prey to that, and this is just too much to say. It's too interesting. Here we have the king's agents staging a debate in some public place about the unrighteousness of the king, of the current king. And then they're supposed to use the responses of the crowd to find out who is seditious amongst the king's people, right? So a wonderful example of the king's agents kind of actively seeking out weaknesses or threats inside of the kingdom. It's all about politics and power. And what's interesting here too is that these two agents are making arguments that are very familiar to us from early Indic political theology, that the king is is descended from Manu Vivasvat, or that the king takes taxes in response for his protection, but they don't really care about any of these arguments. These are being used purely for rhetorical purposes and purely for the purposes of spycraft. All right, so that gives us some flavor of the Arthaśāstra for those that aren't familiar. Now we'll turn to the author and date, and this is where it gets more sticky, and I kind of humbly present my own theory on this. Now, the text ascribes itself explicitly to Kautilya in 2 places. And then in a verse after the final colophon, which is to say after the formal conclusion of the text, it also ascribes both the text and the commentary to one Vishnugupta. The final verse of the text ascribes it to, quote, the man who out of indignation quickly rescued the treatise and the weapon, as also the land that had fallen into the hands of the Nandas. It is he who composed these treatises. And I'm sorry I haven't put the Sanskrit in here. I was trying to keep these slides as short as possible. This is, of course, a reference to the legendary minister of Chandragupta Maurya, Chanakya. So a synoptic reading of these inscriptions would identify Kautilya with Vishnugupta and Chanakya, and on that basis, assign the text a date of the early 3rd century BCE. But there are some problems with these inscriptions, and these are explored through looking at the compositional history of the text. So now I'm going to go back to talk a bit about the formal structure and what it tells us about how the Arthaśāstra was put together. And I want to focus on this presence of what I'm calling redundant segmentation, and that is the presence of 2 different and redundant schemes for dividing the text into smaller units, the 180 prakaranas and the 150 chapters. Now, the best way to understand this is to imagine a novel that was written in chapters, and then someone came through and redivided that same text into different chapters. So that one chapter might start on page 1 and end on page 15 in one segmentary scheme, but in the other one, it might start on page 1 and end on page 7. I call these redundant because neither one is a clear subdivision or articulation of the other. They both operate at the same level of the text in terms of textual division. Now, they show different logics of subdivision, and they therefore cannot be from the same hand. Even Kangle, the esteemed critical editor of the text, recognized that these could not have been created in the same compositional moment. For one, they disagree on topic boundaries. And here I have a kind of visual representation of that. And if you see the boundary between topic 1 and topic 2 understands a thematic shift slightly after the chapters do. And there are other examples of this. And again, I apologize. These are technical arguments, and it's really impossible to present them in all of their detail in a PowerPoint slide. I'm happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. I go into them far more in my book and in some other places. So the result, though, is that these are 2 different moments in the life of the composition of the text. So the question is kind of which one is prior and which one has been overlain. And this is actually quite easy to see once one looks at it, because thematically speaking, the text is composed in prakaranas. And we have here the example of chapter 2.34, which contains 2 topics, the topic on the overseer of passes and the overseer of pasture land. Now, what one can see is that thematically speaking, the coherence lies at the level of the prakarana. Each of these topics is its own thematic discussion, but they have both been organized into a single chapter, and that has been produced simply by the addition of a concluding verse, a sangraha shloka, and a colophon. So what this and other examples show us, this is one of the simplest I could find, but there are many other kinds of examples that show this, is that it is the chapters or the adhyayas, the lessons that have been written over the prakaranas in which the text was composed. Now there are some details here too we can go into, but this is the basic idea. Now what this tells us, therefore, is that the chapter end verses, the adhyaya end verses, like I've 234.12 that I've put in, that I've highlighted here, are not original to the text. They are the work of someone who came in and redivided it into adhyayas, ostensibly for the purpose of teaching it, right? Creating kind of textual segments of more uniform lengths to serve as lessons in some kind of pedagogic environment. So once we understand that this has happened, then we can talk about the redaction of the text, a moment at which an editor came in and kind of redivided the text, and I would argue made other changes to it as well. The extent of the redaction, therefore, would include the addition of chapter end verses and colophons written over the prakaranas. But I would argue, and have argued in my book, that another important element that the redactor introduced to the text were the citations of earlier teachers, including the citations to Kautilya in the text itself. Now, the reasons to believe this are themselves, of course, philological and textual. To begin with, some of the attributions of Kautilya take place in the chapter inverses themselves, which can be safely ascribed to the redaction. Second, these citations follow a standard pattern, which means that the teachers speak in the same order regardless of the topic. And the artificiality of this is particularly clear in the 8th book when they're debating the severity of different calamities to the different elements of the state. And clearly we have the sevenfold theory of the state and this pattern of 8 teachers that have been overlaid over one another for the sake of creating a fictive debate. Most importantly, and what I'll talk about in a second here, is that these citations are clearly used to amend the underlying text. The voice of Kautilya often comes into the text precisely for the purpose of disagreeing with something that the text was just saying. And then there are other tracts identified by various indices that I won't have time to go into. So here's what I mean about the citations of Kautilya amending the underlying text. And again, this is a long passage. I won't have a lot of time to go into it, but this comes from the 7th book, the discussion of foreign policy. And what we can see here is a tract that was composed according to a very clear formula. And I'll read the first one. Among the 6 strategic measures, when by resorting to a particular strategic measure, he foresees, by resorting to this, I will be able to advance my activities relating to forts, irrigation works, trade routes, settling vacant lands, pit mines and produce, and elephant forests, and to hurt these same activities of my enemies. Then he should adopt it, he should do it. This constitutes prosperity. When he realizes my prosperity will be quicker or greater or will lead to further prosperity and the opposite will be true of my enemy, he should tolerate the prosperity of his enemy. Or else, when their prosperity takes equal time and brings the same results, he should enter into a peace pact. So what I've highlighted here with the letters is the formula that is then repeated in the subsequent 2 paragraphs. Excuse me. When resorting to a particular strategic measure, B, the king foresees something will happen, X. C, this constitutes either prosperity, decline, or stability. And D, when he realizes something, then he should tolerate that. Or when the prosperity, decline, or stability lasts an equal time and brings the same result, he should sign a treaty. So the strict structure of this passage shows us that this passage was composed according to this formula. But then at the very end of the 3rd paragraph, we have the words iti acharyaha naitad vibhashitam iti Kautilyaha at the end of the text. And what these words effectively do is they take the last part of the 3rd paragraph, or maybe more, because with iti we can't quite tell how far back the quotation is supposed to go. And it turns that into the apadesha, the opinion, a citation of the acharyas, the teachers. And then Kautilya comes in and says, this is not an alternative. This should not be allowed. This is very strange that the same person who wrote this kind of tightly structured passage should then, at the very end of the 3rd, break with that, sign an opinion to the teachers, and then disagree with it, as opposed to just compose it according to his own prerogative within the framework that he's using. Now, there are other and better examples of this that are kind of more complicated than even this, but this gives the basic idea of how the apadeshas are used to amend or comment on the underlying text. So what I propose in my 2019 book is the extent of the redaction, including chapter inverses and colophons, the attributions to earlier teachers, including Kautilya, and other tracts identified by various indices that are particular to different areas and far too detailed to go into here. So I give a tentative outline of what I think the original recension of the Arthaśāstra looked like in 7 parts, and I give those here. Now, from a perspective of cultural history, what's most interesting about this is once one has accounted for what we might consider to be the additions of the redactor, we find that the early text was absent of any reference to Varna Dharma and any reference to exceptions to be made to Brahmins in law or policy, which I call Brahmanical exceptionalism. Now, there are exceptions made for Shrotriyas and for other kinds of religious figures, but the very standard kind of Brahmanical exceptionalism that we're used to from Dharmashastra and Mahabharata was absent in the early Arthaśāstra. This is my contention. This is my theory. Now, this brings us back to the problems with the attributions. The direct attributions to Kautilya are only found in chapter inverses, which is to say, the only places in the text where it says Kautilya wrote this were added by the Adhyaya redactor, the redactor in my that I've posited. I've also posited that the citations of Kautilya are part of the redaction. The attribution to Chanakya is found also in a chapter inverse, the final inverse, so it must be dated to the redaction or after. And the attribution to Vishnugupta is found after the final colophon, which presumably tells us it was added after the text itself was closed and after the redaction at some point. There's no other testimony of any connection between Chanakya and the Arthaśāstra before about the 3rd century CE, which is to say about the date that I would posit for the redaction. And the oldest versions of the Chanakya legend, insofar as they can be recovered, Thomas Troutman has worked on this, make no mention of any text that Chanakya wrote. The only version of the Chanakya story that really goes into this is the Mudra Rakshasa, which is kind of an addendum to the Chanakya story in many ways. And clearly there, Vishakadatta is putting on display his own knowledge of Arthaśāstra. And so it's not unlikely that the origin of this innovation lies somewhere in the nexus between the redaction of the Arthaśāstra and the composition of the Mudra Rakshasa. So we can say clearly, at least in my theory, and I do hold this out as a theory, the earlier recension of the Arthaśāstra possess no attributions to Kautilya, Chanakya, or Vishnugupta. These all appear to be later innovations, but all we can strictly say is textually speaking, they look late. It's quite possible that these were what you think of as paratextual traditions that orally accompanied the text, but did not find their way into it until the redaction, although we don't have any good evidence of that either. What that means is that the author of the early recension, and perhaps even the name of the early recension of the Arthaśāstra, are unknown. So dating this recension, following Olivel's dating, who himself follows Sivan Levi, dates the early version of the text to 50 to 125 CE. I favor a slightly earlier date because it appears to me that the Gautama Dharma Sutra has borrowed from the early version of the Arthaśāstra. And so it might be a little, in my mind, a little earlier than what Olivel is suggesting. The redaction can be dated based on 2 indices. The first is that the Manusmriti's 7th chapter is based clearly on the Arthaśāstra. I've shown this in an article in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. But critically, it appears to be based on the earlier recension. That is to say, the kind of digest of the Arthaśāstra in the Manusmriti is lacking those same passages that I've posited were added by the redactor. But clearly, Vatsyayana already knows the Arthaśāstra as divided into topics and chapters, as divided into Prakaranas and the Dhyayas, because he models the Kama Sutra precisely on this feature. Although, interestingly for Vatsyayana, the Prakaranas are always regular subdivisions of the Dhyayas. So he saw the division of the Arthaśāstra into Dhyayas and Prakaranas. He recognized that it wasn't regular, and he regularized their relationship when he modeled the Kama Sutra on the Arthaśāstra. So that gives us a proposed date for the redaction between the posited date for the Manusmriti, the 2nd century CE, and the posited date for Kama Sutra, 4th century CE. Okay, so that takes us through the kind of the Arthaśāstra, its composition, its formal features, its dates, and kind of where it fits historically relative to the other Niti texts. And now I'd like to draw back a bit and sketch out some of that broader history. Most often we read, and this is coming out of the scholastic medieval tradition, that Arthaśāstra or Niti developed out of Dharmaśāstra, the idea being that as reflection on the king's duties became more sophisticated and refined, it became necessary to birth a new and specific discipline to help him in the increasingly sophisticated job of running the state. And there is a kind of general way in which, of course, this must be true, right? Some version of this must be how disciplines like this developed. But the idea that there's a direct line that can be traced from Dharmashastric tradition, from the expert tradition of Dharmaśāstra and the experts who composed and transmitted those sources is, to me, incorrect. This is my thinking on that. Our first reference to Kshatriya Vidya, the discipline of rule, is found already in the Chandogya Upanishad. And by any standard, this is going to be earlier than Apastamba or Gautama, or whatever is considered to be the earliest Dharma Sutra. And it's earlier also than our first reference to Dharmaśāstra, which comes in Katyayana's commentary on Panini. And so we have an attestation within the tradition, kind of no matter how we date these texts, the relative dating is clear that references to this statecraft science precede references to Dharmaśāstra. Now, if this is right, and if the dating of the Chandogya is right at the 6th century, then this kind of works, because this is approximately the era of so-called second urbanization in Northeast India, and the emergence of urbanized polities would, stands to reason, necessitate the development of a set of professional counselors organized around a particular kind of expertise. It would suggest then a permanent class or lineage of professional counselors and the professionalization of state activities. We have references to officials who are clearly operating like the Mantrans in Megasthenes Indica from the time of Chandragupta Maurya. And then our next earliest Niti tract, according to Olivel's dating, which I follow here, are the Rajadharma chapters, the last several chapters of the Apastamba Dharma Sutra. Now, in the model wherein Arthaśāstra is derived from Dharmashastra, these are seen as the earliest kind of stirrings of the statecraft tradition. But in light of the fact we have earlier references to Kshatriya Vidya, and we can almost certainly attest to the existence of professionalized mantram class, we know that after centuries of urbanized monarchies, there must have also been a long-standing statecraft tradition as well, in light of which Apastamba's Niti chapters are clearly borrowed. And this works also because the next earliest texts, Gautama and Manu, well, leaving Baudhayana aside, it doesn't really have a focused Niti discussion in the same way. They both clearly borrow from Arthaśāstra as well as Yajnavalkya. So we have a pattern of Dharma texts borrowing from Niti texts. And even though Apastamba would date to earlier than I'm dating the early Arthaśāstra, I still see it as having borrowed from the tradition that preceded the Arthaśāstra. Then we come to the Arthaśāstra, its first recension in the 1st century BCE or CE, and it itself, of course, in its sophistication and in its individual pieces, presupposes some kind of robust earlier tradition. Now, the Arthaśāstra itself represents the maturation of the Niti textual tradition. It concretizes in literary form, as I've said, complete expertise in Niti. It is the advanced manual compared to everything else that is available to us from the period. As Louis Renou pointed out, it itself reflects textually a kind of transitional style between the older model of Sutra Bhasha and the later Shastras that are written kind of a piece. We still see these older sutras kind of embedded in the Arthaśāstra, and we see these Bhashya-like commentaries, but then we see the text going into a more kind of Smriti-like exposition where we leave the Sutra Bhashya model. Now, once we've identified the later material and focus on what I take to be the early recension of the Arthaśāstra, then we understand that it possesses a highly consistent form of disciplinary subjectivity, what I'm calling disciplinary subjectivity. In other words, the problem in the interpretation of the Arthaśāstra's political philosophy is that it seems to be divided. On one hand, the text makes very pious claims about the need for the king to follow Dharma, and on the other hand, it has things like the test of Dharma, which completely undermine those claims. There's been a lot of work to try to figure out and a lot of disagreement about how one should read this disagreement, with some saying that the adherence to Dharma is just paying lip service. It's just enough to get the text into circulation without offending too many people. And others saying, like P.V. Kane, the great historian of Dharmashastra, saying, no, we have to presume a Dharmashastra context for everything we read in the Arthaśāstra. More recently, Stuart Gray, the political scientist, has argued for what he calls Brahmanical realism, which is a kind of savvy way of keeping an adherence to Dharma intact while still attending to the politically needful. So my solution to this problem is one that is rooted in the compositional history of the text, which is to say that the early text was very consistent in its outlook, and it's the integration of new material during the redaction that creates this interpretive problem for the Arthaśāstra. So what is this worldview of the early Arthaśāstra? This gets back to the disciplinary subjectivity of Niti that I started with. I read the Arthaśāstra as the clearest distillation of the tradition. It's a Shastra. But I think it's important to recognize that Shastras are sometimes erroneously called manuals, in the sense that maybe a manual tells you how to assemble a piece of furniture. It's not a manual in that sense, but rather a form of expertise, and that expertise is put in the form of injunctions. And the reason this is important is that even though this text of the Arthaśāstra is formally directed at the king, he should have someone do. Its real audience, of course, was not the king per se, but the students of Niti, the aspirants to high office, the counselors and the counselors to be. Their world is the world of the Arthaśāstra. The king's world is broader than this, because the king is also a dynast and a head of household and a ritual actor and a human with their own kind of salvific and soteriological concerns. So Niti would be a kind of segment of kingship or kingliness from that perspective. This is the world of the king's counselors. This is the world of Chanakya and of individuals like that. That's not to say that some savant kings didn't absorb Niti, didn't take on Niti perspective. Of course they did. But I want to really focus on the expert tradition as our way of reading this text. So what did it provide to counselors as a form of expertise? Well, specific advice. It gave them strategy, wisdom, information, technical terms. And these technical terms delineated a social field that could be conceived as such, in which engagement could be taken technically, and mastery and excellence could be sought, right? It is a shastra, in other words, right? A way of seeing the world in one perspective that allows for a sophisticated engagement. But it also provided what the text calls Shastra Chakshus, the eye of Shastra. And this is where we get into what I think of as the more phenomenological dimension of Shastric education. A way of seeing the world, particularly a way of seeing the world in terms of material politics. And this is what I want to talk about as the disciplinary subjectivity of the Niti tradition, this eye of Shastra, this way that the perception of the world itself is shaped by someone who is steeped in the teachings of a text like the Arthaśāstra. So there are 5 features of the disciplinary subjectivity that I want to go over. I'm going to read from a prepared text to discuss these now. We'll go through them one at a time. As an instructional manual, the Arthaśāstra was intended primarily to educate aspiring counselors in the proper techniques of governance. And we see this mentioned in chapter 5.4 of the Arthaśāstra. One way to think of this education is the imparting of the kinds of knowledge that are embedded in the Shastra itself. These analytical tools and advice are the furniture of expertise, inasmuch as they identify an area of study and engage it as, quote, a target of intervention, end quote. But mastery of Niti was also said to confer a new way of seeing the world. This is what the Arthaśāstra calls the eye of Shastra. It is gained by instruction in Niti, and although the notion was not unique to the Niti tradition, it appears to have had some special currency there. It's mentioned several times in the text. Just to call a minister sighted, chakshumat, or a king blind, andha, was understood as an allusion to the eye of Shastra. There are those that see and those that don't see. Only those who really understand Niti can truly see the way things are in the world. At one level, the eye of Shastra is nothing more than a metaphor used to extol the empowerment found through deep learning. At the same time, its applicability to Niti is not purely metaphorical. It speaks to a qualitative enhancement of one's perception, familiar to Niti as the ability to recognize the material opportunities and threats presented by different situations, and in particular, to detect the maneuvers an opponent has hidden behind seemingly innocuous or random actions and events, and to hide one's own maneuvers in the same way. A quality desired of all high officers, the eye of Shastra prevented a king from falling under the power of his enemy. While possession of the eye, along with wisdom, enabled the king, quote, to accept counsel with little effort and outwit his rivals, even if they are possessed of industry and power by means of strategies such as conciliation, secret practices, and occult measures. That's Arthaśāstra 829. Part of what made the Arthaśāstra a masterpiece of statecraft in the classical period is the sense of verisimilitude generated by the text. This arises in part from its rendition of the material everyday world in an abundance of detail. Its pages are filled with recondite princes, scheming ministers, faithless husbands, dishonest merchants, pious innkeepers, and vulnerable courtesans commingling in villages, festivals, caravanserais, cities, ports, and palaces. An envoy stands in the court of a foreign king, delivering the message of his lord. Agents entrap purveyors of false charms and potions. Ministers gather to save the kingdom on the death of the king. Chapter after chapter of concrete nuance show enough, and in enough detail, to generate the sense that the subject of the early Arthaśāstra is indeed the world itself. This world comes into view through deliberations on techniques of governance, the concepts, resources, obstacles, and aims of statecraft. Its connective tissue is the king and his agents, acting in or in relation to their official capacities. Through their activities, the world of Niti is populated and mapped. Take this passage from instructions to the superintendent of liquor, the Suradhyaksha. Here, a tavern is not merely a building or business, but a vibrant social location that comes alive as a site for the work of royal agents. Just as taverns are depicted as places for controlling the distribution of liquor and spying on the unwary, so too guilds, monasteries, Brahmin settlements, and families all exist in this world, but specifically as subjects of law and policy or contexts for political activities. The fundamental units of society are themselves political. Kingdoms of 7 constituents, split into city and country and surrounded by a circle of enemies and allies. There is, to be certain, a complete world within the early Arthaśāstra, and according to the eye of Shastra, it is the real world. This world is brought into focus through the material interests of the king, the preservation and expansion of his capacity to overcome his rivals, which we can think of as Artha. We can think of this disposition as the force that animates the richly drawn world of the Arthaśāstra, enhancing its verisimilitude and shaping the subjectivity of the students of the Shastra by endowing the constituents of that world with an a priori value and meaning. As in the description of the tavern just discussed, the denizens, places, and events within the world of the Arthaśāstra, all in this way, are put in motion and come to life specifically in their capacity to help or harm the interests of the kings. This disposition is encapsulated by the term artha, which can be translated in this sense as success, advantage, material benefit, wealth, or power. It lends itself to another name for the Niti tradition, Arthaśāstra, the science of success. Artha expresses itself through the logic of raw efficacy, and in a royal context, it speaks to resources, strategy, will, power, and victory. Virtues or aims other than artha are occasionally expressed and explored in the early Arthaśāstra, but the root philosophy of the text is made explicit in this passage from the 6th book, power and success. Power is strength and success is happiness. And then the text goes through the threefold versions of each, and it says, when he has been strengthened by these, he becomes stronger. When he is weakened with respect to these, he becomes inferior. And when he has equal power, he becomes co-equal. This passage speaks of the ways that a king's undertakings find success, siddhi. The success is defined as happiness, sukha, which reinforces the view of governance, and perhaps even kingship itself as a series of successful material undertakings. Equating success with happiness also renders governance as a closed moral system within which kings could, if so minded, pursue their own flourishing and personal fulfillment solely through the pursuit of success. In other words, this passage implies that the success of undertakings is the only goal of statecraft, whatever other collateral goods, personal or public, that success might bring. This is reinforced in the last sentence, which uses power and success as a diagnostic to assess standing relative to the king's standing relative to his adversaries, a totalizing hierarchy closed to other evaluative criteria. The section of the text concludes with what might be considered the defining axiom of statecraft in the early Niti tradition. Therefore, the king should strive to bring power and success to himself, or if he is similar to his rival, to his ministerial constituents in accordance with their contiguity or integrity, or else he should strive to take these away from traitors and enemies. Keeping in mind that this falls in that hinge chapter, which I think we should read with kind of particular interest when it comes to interpreting the rest of the text. The guiding principle of governance holds that a king should act in such a way as to become more powerful, which is to say more capable of achieving success and more successful relative to his adversaries. In the end, the king's development of policy is to be guided by the enhancement of his capacity to achieve his political goals. Extant Niti texts exhibit and sometimes ardently claim devotion to values other than raw efficacy, such as dharma and the public good. But the fundamental orientation of Niti can be found in the passage here. When royal counselors are asked, what is artha? They're being asked, what will bring me the greatest success? Whatever other advice the counselor might be called to render, this is the question that expertise in Niti disciplined a counselor to answer. From this perspective, the world of Niti, and likely the Niti tradition itself, can be said to have its beginnings in the isolation and exaltation of material benefit and the evaluation of all royal activities, regardless of cultural or religious context. Because the king is where sovereignty and political resources were concentrated in Indic monarchy, we might be tempted to equate the interests of Niti with the interests of the king in toto, but this would be an error. Kingship was much broader than Niti, and kings were not merely sovereign powers embedded within and distributed through deputed agents. They were also heads of household, dynasts, warriors, ritual actors, and subjects of theology. All of these identities brought its own obligations and expectations. Niti, in this sense, represents just one aspect of kingship, albeit a dominant one: material benefit and success. Although Niti texts are formally addressed to kings, the primary audience of the early Arthaśāstra is not the king, but the counselor in training. The mantran is the true creature of Niti. Insofar as this training rendered him an authority on statecraft and suitable for service to the king, it was his or any high official's professional obligation to serve as a loyal partisan and enhance his lord's material position shrewdly and unflinchingly. In practice, mantrans were expected to take into account and provide counsel on moral conduct as well, but their training in niti was designed specifically so that such considerations would not dissuade them from understanding the needful. Think back to the test of dharma. At any rate, the tradition of niti only taught what was artha, not dharma, and it taught him to think of artha not only in isolation from dharma, but also as more fundamental and prior to dharma. Artha is pursued in the early Arthaśāstra with the understanding that human effort, as opposed to fate or the will of the gods, daiva karman, is generally sufficient to bring strategic plans to fruition. There is no trace of heroic fatalism, pious supplication, or superstition in the text. More specifically, human activity is itself conceived within an empirical and materialist framework. The Arthaśāstra makes this clear in one of its most theoretical passages. There we read, good and bad policy pertain to human activity, manusha karman, while good and bad fortune pertain to divine activity, daiva karman. Divine and human activity make the world run. The divine consists of what is caused by an invisible agent. Of this, attaining a desirable result is good fortune or good luck, while attaining an undesirable result is bad fortune. The human consists of what is caused by a visible agent. Of this, the success of enterprise and security is good policy. And enterprise and security, there is yogic shema, which I'll talk about in a minute, while their failure is bad policy. This is within the range of thought, whereas the divine is beyond the range of thought. In this passage, manusha karman is defined not just as human activity, but more generally as that which is caused by a visible agent and is knowable. The realm of manusha karman is, in this sense, broader than personal intentional action and reflects what we might think of as the empirical world of cause and effect, in which specific actions can be based on their observable outcomes, and observable outcomes can be traced to specific actions, specific causes. In contrast to this, daiva karman is defined as that which is caused by an invisible agent and is unknowable. This too is much broader than the concept of fate or divine agency, and is expressed rather as those aspects of reality for which the specific relationships between cause and effect cannot be empirically identified. There is no sense of empiricist or materialist triumphalism in this formulation, however, as the text maintains the ultimate unknowability of the causes of some things. Daiva, as acts of God, such as floods or famine, call for shanti pacificatory rites, but only in addition to material remediation. Nor are these philosophical claims made for their own sake. There is no independent interest here in ontology or metaphysics, as we do find when these topics are discussed in philosophical treatises. Instead, the text uses an epistemological distinction to establish a subjective framework from which to engage in planning and carrying out governance. A particular policy is good and wise if, through knowable relations of cause and effect, it leads to enterprise and security. But whereas yogic shema is usually thought of as the enterprise and security of society, the Arthaśāstra carefully defines it as the enterprise and security of the king. So we're back into the king's interests exclusively. Events with unseen causes might disrupt these plans, but the remedy for that is simply more good policy. The implication is that the difference between good and bad policy is grounded in the proper evaluation of empirical circumstances. Reflecting on the origin of this empirical bent, and I should be putting empirical in scare quotes here, there's much more to be said, as well as materialist, but I use this language as a way of kind of communicating what I see as the more essential subjectivity of the text. Reflecting on the origin of this empirical bent, we are most likely to find it in the self-confidence of powerful counselors who saw themselves as masters of the world. The character of Chanakya in Vishakadatta's play Mudra Rakshasa, the paragon of political strategy, exemplifies this attitude. He says, quote, "Only my talent must not forsake me. In the accomplishment of political purposes, that single faculty is more than a match for hundreds of legions. The magnitude of its powers has been amply proved by my destruction of the Nandas," end quote. It is characteristic of niti to see counsel as the first and most potent of the king's powers. But this can only be so if the world can indeed be mastered by the strategic intellect. While a martial text like the Mahabharata often exhibits a fatalistic belief that the efforts of men are often overwhelmed by powers beyond their control, the epistemological reflex of niti, the haunt of highly educated and hubristic ministers, favors an empiricist materialism and the conquerability of the world by the mind. The early Arthaśāstra's simultaneous disinterest in ontology, ethics, and things unseen speaks to a tradition defined by pragmatism. It is the natural posture for a mentality absorbed in outwitting and overmastering that sees the human intellect as the most effective tool in the toolbox. This pragmatism leads not to metaphysical speculation, but rather a functional concern with epistemology as establishing a relationship between knowledge and the world. All the same, it is a presupposition of this posture that the world can be accurately known through observation of material causes and effects, and that this knowledge is sufficient to control the world politically. The early Arthaśāstra thus approaches the world from an empirical and materialist posture, prudently disregarding fate or any other invisible agencies in its machinations. In this, the text manifests a phenomenology that the philosopher Charles Taylor has called, quote, the immanent frame, end quote, an experience of the world as devoid of transcendent elements or agencies and a defining feature of secularity. As just discussed, the early Arthaśāstra does recognize fate as an invisible cause of events. In Taylor's terms, then, the immanent frame of the text would remain open to the transcendent, or at least to the immaterial. In its instructions, however, the text's immanent frame tends towards closure, inasmuch as fate or other invisible agencies are absent in discussions of tactics and strategy. Whether open or closed, the immanent frame of the early Arthaśāstra marks it as a secular text after its own particular fashion. If, as proposed, the secularity of the Niti tradition is rooted not in philosophical inquiry, but in something closer to ministerial hubris, then we should expect an inclination toward the latter position, a thoroughgoing secularity closed to the existence of non-material forces. It is this posture that I detect in the instructions of the early Arthaśāstra, and is also the opinion professed by Chanakya in the Mudra Rakshasa. His unrivaled acumen is dramatized in part by his opinion that, quote, only the unlearned believe in fate, while lesser counselors, such as his rival Rakshasa, express just such a belief in fate, and thereby fail to recognize that what they understand to be fate is actually the unfolding of Chanakya's strategy. Consistent with this, Vishakhadatta's Chanakya, despite carrying out the religious life of a highly educated Brahmin Shrotriya, is a thoroughly secular man, wholly shaped by the disciplinary subjectivity of Niti. He is the man of Niti. There are limits, however, to thinking of the Arthaśāstra, and by extension the early Niti tradition, as secular, at least in a modern sense. The Niti tradition does not appear to have been dogmatic in its commitments, and there is little evidence that the tradition ever tried to develop its point of view into a more public ideology that we would associate with something like secularism. It may be possible to speak of varieties of public secularism prevailing in different sectors of ancient Indian society, but the Niti tradition does not ever seem to have attempted to legitimize the king or the state publicly by appealing to their commitment to a secular approach to governance. The secularity of the early Niti tradition is real, I would argue, but it reflects the perspective of ambitious and hubristic counselors contending in the white-hot crucible of political power, where the personal and interpersonal where the personal and interpersonal were shaped by survival, success, and reputation amidst vast accumulation of political resources. It is not, in other words, a rival to theological or religious worldviews, but the consequence of a hollowing out of their values, the values espoused in those worldviews, based on the experience in what I'm calling the crucible of power. So I see these 5 features as characteristic of the disciplinary subjectivity that itself characterized the early Niti tradition and is most evident in the early recension of the Arthaśāstra. But I would argue that it is present, whether lurking or shining through, in all Niti texts, despite claims of adherence to countervailing virtues like piety or sacred law. I realize I've run longer than I anticipated, so I'm going to, again, have a very wordy PowerPoint slide, but I'm going to attempt to move through this quickly without sacrificing too much detail. In the redaction of the Arthaśāstra, as I said, passages are interpolated that bring in the theology of Varna Dharma and bring in the legal policy and state policy of Brahmanical exceptionalism, whereby Brahmins receive special treatment under the law and in state policy. And also there is Apadesha attributed to Kautilya there that argues that Dharma is necessary, but that Artha is its root. So kind of maintaining what I'm saying is a very kind of skillful means of not trying to push Dharma out or contest Dharma, but basically to kind of erode it from within under the influence of Artha. Other texts of the greater Niti tradition also deal with this tension, and they do so through the concept of Raja Dharma, which term is not itself found in the Arthaśāstra. In Dharma Shastra, this is presented relatively flatly. The Dharma Shastra, Manu at least, doesn't really get into the problems that this creates in terms of axiology or competing values. And Artha is there always in the service of Dharma, and there aren't really any conflicts between the two discussed. Of course, it's in the Mahabharata where much of this comes to the light, where the conflict between Artha, or what's sometimes called Kshatriya Dharma in the text, and Dharma are themselves the subject of extensive reflection. Of course, with the final position that Artha must serve to uphold Dharma in the end. The violence of Artha must serve to uphold Dharma, sometimes paradoxically. And so as I read these kinds of texts in the later classical period, it occurs to me there's only really ever a partially successful resolution of the relationship between Dharma and Artha. There is, in other words, a kind of ongoing tension between what we might call the political and the religious that texts continue to grapple with, and I think we can be certain that ministers and kings did as well. But all that said, Artha had an ongoing source in the material needs of kings. Regardless of what was happening in the textual tradition, kings always needed shrewd counselors who were able to kind of focus clearly in on how to get the job done. One place, however, where we see the unalloyed commitment to Artha is precisely in the Chanakya stories, and in the Mudra Rakshasa in particular. Chanakya there is the Arthaśāstra personified, I would say, and in its own way, I think Mudra Rakshasa can be read as a commentary on the Arthaśāstra. There's no Dharma, there's no Daiva, there's no Devas in any of his thinking. He is the man of Niti, and that Vishakadatta could see this so clearly tells us, of course, that we're on the right track in isolating this disciplinary subjectivity. One of the ways that this debate gets played out in an interesting way is something that hasn't drawn a lot of attention in studies of political thought in the period, and that is the way that the idea of Manusha Karman and Daiva Karman are used to negotiate these different influences. And I lay out the three examples that I can see most clearly: the early Arthaśāstra, which says that there's both matter, but really only human effort matters because we can't do anything about Daiva anyway. So functionally, we're kind of in this kind of what I'm calling this kind of immanent frame. Mahabharata, one is very wary of summarizing the Mahabharata in any kind of easy way. But I said the predominant view is that fate controls the destinies of men. Human effort is necessary, but somehow is mysteriously wrapped up in the will of the gods. And then finally we have Mudra Rakshasa. Only fools believe in fate. The world can be mastered by a genius intellect, and what lesser minds think of as fate or the will of the gods is really just the machinations of their betters. So when we step back out now to look at the Niti tradition, I think this focus on the disciplinary subjectivity of the early tradition helps us to think about the different kinds of texts we have. And particularly it does so by helping us think about them in terms of audience. If the royal official to be is the primary audience of a text like the Arthaśāstra, then we can see how the king or princes or members of the royal court or the literati might have been the audiences or expected audiences that shaped some of the other texts and what I'm thinking of as the greater Niti corpus in the classical period. And these audiences help us think through also kind of what's happening in these texts with relationship to negotiation between what we can think of as Artha and Dharma. That is to say, between the needful and the pious, or between the needful and religious values, different audiences speaking in different contexts. You know, a minister in private councils might feel very free to tell his fellow ministers what he truly thinks, but when it comes time to speak in the court amongst a mixed audience, it may be necessary to reframe some of these arguments. And certainly when trying to publicize a text more broadly, a separate set of audience considerations would probably come in. So to kind of summarize, I see the early Arthaśāstra as really the only glimpse into the real inner life of the Niti tradition. And by comparison, the other texts that I put there, the Rajadharma texts, are really clearly religious texts with other purposes that integrate Niti teachings, but do so with an interest in Niti, of course, but not with an interest in solely educating individuals in Niti, much more for the purpose of illustrating the king's duties, or in the case of the Dharmashastra, getting at the legal aspects of the system which they are most interested in. And even the Niti Sara, which is, of course, more cited and better tested in the textual and manuscript evidence than the Arthaśāstra, is itself clearly a kind of attempt to make the Arthaśāstra more accessible and readable to a wider audience. And that seems to have worked. It seems to have supplanted the Arthaśāstra in most libraries, I would say, by the medieval period. But again, and this is Iyengar's position, the Niti Sara is much more of a Panditic scholastic exercise than the manual of education by someone we imagine Chanakya to have been an acharya and practitioner of statecraft. So when the Arthaśāstra is redacted around the 3rd century, Orthodox Brahmanical political theology seems to have been in the ascendant. And this may have been the early centuries of what Bhandarkar, the senior, called Brahmanical revival, the Brahmanical revival. But it could also be that the redaction of the Arthaśāstra was part of its publicization among a broader audience, and therefore it may have been necessary to kind of soften some of its teachings a little bit. But there are two trends we can see in Niti texts after the Arthaśāstra. First is the heavy if not exclusive influence of Rajadharma as a way of framing Niti. The Vishakadatta's text being the only example really to the contrary, and of course, importantly, a drama, not a shastra at all itself. And so maybe something to said about how its generic properties enabled that when it wouldn't have been possible in later Rajadharma texts. The other thing we see is an atrophy of the textual tradition. Most everything after the Arthaśāstra is derivative, and we don't see anything approaching its genius in the Sanskrit statecraft tradition thereafter. So the question then is why? That's what I'll kind of leave us with today. And I apologize for going over time. I get a little excited about these topics sometimes. Clearly, political genius did not end with the Arthaśāstra. So what happened? Was Niti something that was underground for a long time in the sense that it was not part of kind of public literate culture? And did it perhaps go back underground? Or is in that sense, is the Arthaśāstra an anomaly? Is it a text we shouldn't have? Is it something that was privately circulated and then somehow through its redaction became publicized to a different kind of audience? Did statecraft not particularly lend itself to literization? The Arthaśāstra itself says that statecraft has to be learned both from speakers, vaktras, and prayoktras, practitioners. Was this something that was much better learned from practitioners? Or were texts themselves not a great way to teach this? Were regional traditions too diverse? And here, inscriptions may point the way. That's an area that I hope to be able to look into next. One other possibility was the Arthaśāstra less a manual for practice, as I've suggested, and really more of a study guide for exams, in which case it could have maintained its position as a kind of examination text, even as its teachings departed from the practice of statecraft through the late classical and the early medieval period. Once it was written and had kind of had the final word, was another statecraft text like it not really needed? That's the question I leave you with. Those are just some very, very broad speculations. I thank you for your attention. I do apologize for going over time, and I look forward to discussing any and all of this in the discussion sections. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, could you stop the screen share? Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I think that is a very, very exhaustive lecture on the Niti traditions and with your special expertise on...
Exhaustive or exhausting?
No, it was exhaustive. It was definitely not exhausting, filled with a lot of factual information. I'm sure I personally enjoyed to see the concept of Artha, how did it evolve or change with time from the early Arthaśāstra, Mahabharata, and Rakshasa. And I'm sure there's so many other important and interesting facts that you posed and presented. And we have a lot of questions, and now the floor is open for comments and discussions. I would first start with Madhavji. Sir, I am unmuting you.
Thank you, Mark, for such a wonderful and exhaustive lecture. Some of the things that occurred to me, and I would like you to explore those. How would you compare the information that we get about statecraft and state of kingship in Megasthenes and Kautilya? And the other thing is that I get a sense that you believe that this is a post-Maurya Brahmanical sort of ideology emerging. So again, contrasting kingship as we see in Ashoka inscriptions, for example, with what we see in Arthaśāstra.
Thank you. The Indika is a very interesting text. I'm sure, as you know and others know, it's not clear what Megasthenes is drawing from observation, what he's drawing from informants, and what he's projecting from kind of standard generic tropes amongst Greek-trained authors for writing about different kinds of cultures. But there is, so when I read Megasthenes, I tend to look for those points of convergence. And one of them that's very close is this discussion of the mantrans, who are these officials that help the king pick his other officials, which is kind of precisely what we see them doing in the Arthaśāstra. Now, there are other features of Megasthenes that are very curious. Of course, he has the 7 classes of Indian society as opposed to the 4 varnas. But one of these classes is mantrans, which I think prompts us to think about them in terms of lineage, in terms of families, as their own kind of sector of society in some ways. When it comes to Megasthenes' description of either the domestic government or the government kind of in the running of the city of Pataliputra or of the running of the empire, we see a lot of divergence. His various councils that run Pataliputra are not mentioned anywhere in the Arthaśāstra. So it's really a mixed bag, and it gets back to the question of Megasthenes' reliability as a source. And again, my reading strategy is to tend to find the places where they agree and to make some kind of assessment as to, particularly when the agreement is specific like that. Yeah, so I take the Arthaśāstra as the product of Brahmanical culture very broadly. We're certainly talking about Laukika Brahmins probably here, as opposed to, say, so-called worldly Brahmins that are mentioned in the literature, as opposed to what we might think of as a kind of Apastamba or a Shrotriya living in the countryside. Written in Sanskrit clearly, and also clearly Vedic in its orientation. The king has a what we might call Vedic culturally in its orientation. The king has a Purohita, he has a Ritvij, he has a Acharya very much in the Vedic model. So it culturally coming out of a Vedic kind of cultural context, and yet almost untouched in its ideology by Vedic political theology. There's no real discussion of Brahman and Kshatriya or any of the ways that the royal power is discussed in the Vedic ritual texts. Now, all of that said, and I see another question is going in this direction, the Arthaśāstra was not written de novo in the sense that whoever wrote this kind of first composition in whatever form did not sit down and kind of write from scratch. This is a tradition, and it looks back on tradition. So certainly some parts of the Arthaśāstra are going to reflect things that go back to the Mauryan period, almost certainly. But even there, the names of officials in Mauryan and in Ashokan inscriptions is different, importantly, than the officials in the Arthaśāstras. Others who are on this call can attest better than I. And so, like many things, studying this period, we have very little evidence and a lot of unknowns. And so there's a tendency, I think, to try to stitch things together tightly that we have, but also a need to recognize just the vast gaps between our sources. And of course, the fact of a great deal of diversity in political practice and political thought, whereas our texts, particularly the texts from the Orthodox tradition, consistently try to kind of put forward a unified worldview. They're clearly doing so against the pressure of what must have been a very garrulous and heterogeneous set of cultural presuppositions. So I don't know if that really gets fully to your question.
Okay. Sir, you're on mute. I'm unmuting you. Yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you for that thoughtful answer.
Thank you, Professor Mark. I think we'll take 10 more minutes and so that we can accommodate a few more questions. I see Aloka ji's hands up. Aloka ma'am, over to your question.
Yeah, thank you. My question, first of all, wonderful lecture, Professor McClish. You very, very clearly explained what perhaps could be the sources from the Smriti, the Sutra tradition, and also the impact that the Arthaśāstra had. My question is, to what extent was customary law a source for the Arthaśāstra? Because you said at some point that the Arthaśāstra was really not meant only as a manual for kings and Raj Dharma, but it was actually meant as a source for training students in Niti. So in that context, towards the conclusion, you said that because there's so much of diversity, regional diversity, and the Arthaśāstra continued to remain a dramatic text, to what extent does the Arthaśāstra say anything about how does one look at customary law? Because in the Shastras, they talk about Desh and Kal, and that, rules can change depending on Desh and Kal. Manu and others also mentioned that. So just wanted your response on that. Thank you.
This is a wonderful question, and thank you for asking. I have an article recently that discusses the origins of the Vyavahara legal system and customary law inside of the Niti tradition, and I'd be happy to share that with you. By customary law, I'm thinking here of Vyavahara, of civil law, of kind of law of transactions. My theory is that the Arthaśāstra has our oldest, it's not my theory, I think it's recognized. The Arthaśāstra has the oldest code of civil law of Vyavahara and extant from the classical period. And I see Vyavahara, as the word says, every day, kind of common, right? I see the Vyavahara code as being very much rooted in customary practices of exchange, particularly in social contexts where people from different cultural communities were engaging in trade, which I think is precisely where a Vyavahara code would have been needed. So this is to say markets, but then also even more cosmopolitan spaces. There's an analog in ancient Near Eastern culture where the kind of earliest legal codes are coming out of very cosmopolitan spaces because rulers are interested in regulating those exchanges, but also preventing the flare-up of violence over disagreements. So that when we look at something like the Vyavahara Code and the Arthaśāstra, what I see when I look at it is a first attempt to stitch together a comprehensive set of rules that can serve as a legal backdrop in situations where the customs of a particular group can't resolve a situation. So the Arthaśāstra famously talks about the 4 feet of jurisprudence, which I'm sure you're familiar with, as Dharma, Charitra, Vyavahara, and Rajashasana. So Dharma in this sense, I think, means just kind of what's just and righteous. Charitra is the customs of a particular region. This is kind of Desha Dharma or something like this. And then Vyavahara, which is the state code, right? Vyavahara only ever pertains to states, and it's only ever enacted under the aegis of a state judge. And we see this also clearly in Dharmashastra and even later periods. And then we have Rajashasana, which is the king's edict, which supersedes all of these. This is the early formation of the 4 feet. They get reconfigured later in the Dharmashastra tradition, but Patrick Oliver and I have an article arguing that this was their original form. And so the idea being that when the local customary law of a group and its dispute resolution mechanisms were incapable of solving a dispute, that's when it came before the king. This is not an activist legal state. It's a legal state that's developed a legal code, in my argument, that serves as a backdrop to catch those cases that aren't otherwise able to be resolved in local tribunals and courts. And so Vyavahara would have been kind of, instead of a statute law legislated and imposed, it's much more of an attempt to kind of gather together what are best practices that are observed amongst transactions, everyday transactions, particularly in social locations where people from different cultural groups are coming together and they don't all recognize a common legal authority. Then it must be the king. So I don't know if that gets to your question in particular, but I think we can see that the state's interest in developing a legal code of this kind. And incidentally, even though, of course, in the later period, we don't think of Vyavahara as state law, Dharmashastra is increasingly seen as a form of expertise and a kind of scholastic exercise. I don't know that we should have the same assumption for the Arthaśāstra. Whoever patronized this text and had it put together may well have said, why not? Give me a code. I want this text to have a code for my judges to use. And we know that Ashoka himself says he wants samatha amongst his Nagalaviyohalakas, amongst his judges. He wants uniformity. And so there's not too far of a stretch of the imagination to say, well, what does that look like? Well, let's get some rules down, procedural rules and then substantive law that we can circulate amongst judges, that we can kind of try to get that uniformity that's so essential to the idea of justice, that everyone's being treated the same way. So I know that's a long answer. I hope that gets to the question you were asking.
Thank you, Professor Mark. Ma'am, Aloka ma'am, if you could just briefly...
just thank you, but could you please send us that article or you can send it to Professor Menon and she can...
Definitely, ma'am. We'll coordinate on that.
Yeah,
because
that's really important for us to read. That's all.
Oh, great, thank you. Let me do that.
Aloka ma'am, if you could briefly introduce yourself before we take the next question so that everybody is aware.
I'm Professor Aloka Parashar Sen and I teach history at the University of Hyderabad. And I've written some stuff on the Arthaśāstra, which Professor McClish probably knows.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Yeah. Next question, I would request Nija ma'am. Ma'am had a question. I'm unmuting you. Nija Raghavanji.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm just a student of Sanskrit. I know very little, but I'm very interested in this. So I am a teacher educator. And my question was, is there any reference in the Arthaśāstra to the role of the queen? And has there been any mention of female ministers anywhere?
Great questions. The second one is easier, and sadly the answer is no. In the Arthaśāstra, not that I'm familiar with. Of course, inscriptional record shows us the role of women in certain high offices in states, the occasional role of women. But the Arthaśāstra does not discuss women in amongst the high officials, with the exception of the queens, and then there's some discussion of the king's harem. We do have some spies that are specifically Brahmin women, Brahmin renouncer women, because they are understood to have access to better access to certain kinds of private spaces. But there is no discussion in the Arthaśāstra, of which I'm aware, and I don't think there is at all, of women playing a role in, other than the queen, in high governance. How the women of the royal family and the court do appear in very Arthaśāstric style. The queen receives a salary. She is one of the senior members of the government in that sense. But mainly the queen, and not only the queen, but the princes are threats to the king. This is the primary mode in which we read about both of them, so that the queens can't visit the king without being searched. And there's a litany of kings that have been assassinated by their queens. Likewise, the women of the royal harem, Antahapura, have to go through all kinds of searches and other kinds of control before the king is allowed to visit them. So this gets, I mean, we'd love to have that information, but this gets to my point that the text is so exclusively focused on the success and well-being of the king, not kingship in general, but the king that's being served, exclusively understood to be male, and everyone around is a threat, with the exception of perhaps the king's counselors, who are also something of a threat. But I wish I could say more about that. One has to go into other sources to get better information on those topics.
Thank you, Professor. One question by Mr. Arnab Bhattacharya, sir, had a question. We're short of time. We'll probably take more questions in the document we are curating, and we'll get back to you. We'll probably end with Arnab sir's question. Sir, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So fantastic lecture. Thank you again for this. I had actually two questions, but the first question is kind of answered, that this is an editorial work, it seems. So maybe the bulk of the text was done during Kautilya's time, and later on in the 3rd century CE, it took the final form. So please comment on that. That is one question. The second question is there anything said about the dynastic politics? Like, should the son of a minister get a natural preference for being a minister? This is very important in the Indian political context, at least now. So
right.
So please.
Certainly.
Yeah.
To the first question, we can't rule out, and I think have to hold open the possibility that parts of the Arthaśāstra could go back to the Mauryan period. What those would be is less clear, so it's more of a hypothetical. More to the point, I think, is that even if that's the case, there are other reasons to recognize the Arthaśāstra as simply not a Mauryan text as it's put together now. It's not an imperial text. It doesn't think about politics in a kind of densely trans-regional way, if that makes sense. It is very much conceptualizing the anatomy of the state as king, Janapada, capital city, bordering kingdoms of the same size. It's a Mahajanapada or Janapada model. And one could argue that this was a kind of formalized feature of statecraft that persisted even through the rise of the Mauryan Empire. So that statecraft had been developed in the habit of talking about polity from, say, the 5th century BCE before the Mauryans. But we'd still have to explain then why such a great mind as Chanakya or Kautilya or whoever put this together in the Mauryan period didn't address the kinds of imperial problems that Ashoka himself is addressing in the edicts, which has to do with, the authority of regional individuals, the appointment of princes as governors and none of these officials are ever discussed. So it's simply not an imperial text in that sense. So while on one hand, we want to hold open the possibility that some of the material in there is much older, and why not? It nonetheless is difficult to read the Arthaśāstra as a Mauryan source. It's just not describing the same kind of state. And it's not describing the same kinds of officials. So what we make of that is kind of still to be determined. As to dynasty, there's not a whole lot about dynastic politics in the Arthaśāstra. It's kind of a synoptic view of the rule of, one king. There's a discussion of princes in which it's discussed, what do you do with a prince who has, durbudhi, right? Someone who's kind of a bad intellect. And then, you ship him off to someone where he won't be a problem, or maybe he'll even be killed. But then there's instructions to the prince that gets shipped off and how one retains their good graces of the father, or perhaps even comes back to conquer. There is a discussion of the of succession at the end of the 5th book, which again is a very interesting book. That's where the ministers are directly addressed. And in that last of the 3 chapters that addresses the ministers is what happens upon a calamity to the king. And there is different possibilities given there, but it's by no means certain that it should just go, say, to the eldest son. The Mantrans and the Amatyas have to get together and kind of figure that out. And there's even a case where you could have a rule by the counselors if that's kind of what's required. So I think everyone's preference for there to be a Rama in the wings, right? A kind of obvious successor, pious and strong, and but the text is much more concerned about the other situations, which must have been as or more likely.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Arnabji, before that, if you could just introduce yourself to the audience, and yeah, thank you.
All right. So I am a professor of computer science and engineering at IIT Kanpur. So I'm very interested in this history and Sanskrit, but my profession is completely different. Okay.
Very good.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. With this, we'll close the session, and I will read out a few questions asked by participants and audiences today. Some of them are by Mr. Sundar. The Arthaśāstra may also have a lot to say on public administration, revenue collection, optimal use of resources, etc. Do you think that in modern times and the prevalence of democracy, Arthaśāstra may be more relevant earlier with increased complexity of both goals, objectives, and means? There is a question by Sagmit Sahaji. Thank you for this fascinating lecture. Just a generic inquiry. How do we compare the idea of sovereignty of Niti with that of the Dharma literature? And then from Yoga Samskritam, what is your view on how state should handle the wealth and assets of religious institutions in normal administration? Can religion be alternate power center to state and king? Ushmaji, I see your hands up because of crunch of time. If you could please write to us. We'll forward all these questions to Professor Mark and take answers from him, and we'll definitely get back to you on that. With this, we wrap the session, and I would request Professor Sangeeta Menon, ma'am, for your final comments before we wrap the session.
Preet, maybe I think I'll say a few things at the very end. Maybe we should go ahead with the vote of thanks.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely, ma'am. Okay. Madhavji, anything? Professor Madhav, if you have anything to say, sir, before we conclude.
No, I'm so happy to see Mark. Here we have, I think many of you do not know this, but there are Guru Shishya Paramparas also in the West. And here we have a Guru Shishya Parampara, starting with Professor Ludo Roche of the University of Pennsylvania, and Patrick Olivelle was his student. I myself was a student of Professor Roche, and Mark is a student of Patrick Olivelle. And so here we have a Guru Shishya Parampara there. So I'm so glad to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Madhav. It is, thank you for giving us this information. It's really nice to learn about it, that you all are connected. And I could see Professor Mark also quoting Professor Olivelle in the lecture we had. One lecture by him also on Dharmashastra. And with this, I would request Niharika ji to inform us about our upcoming lecture and for the formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Niharika ji.
Thank you, Preet. I'll start with the upcoming lecture, which is on 7th April. It's at 10:30 a.m., which is the Indian time. It is by Professor Amba Kulkarni, and the topic of the lecture is Panini's Astadhyayi from conceptual perspective. I'm sorry. So yeah, and with this, I would really like to thank Professor Mark. So it was a wonderful lecture, and for some reason it took us back for a memory train of such the modern empire, and also knowing and reliving our childhood stories about Chanakya, who is an eminent guru and also a person who defined Niti and also practiced it. So thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful lecture. I'll personally thank Professor Sangeeta Menon and Professor Madhav, who came up with this extraordinary idea to have this Sanskrit lecture series. And it was a gateway for all young scholars like us to know such eminent scholars and hear their thoughts on various topics. So thank you everyone on that. I would thank Meera for that amazing invocation that she did today. Thank you, Preet, for coordinating the course, and the back support, Ashwini and Abhishek, for all the work that they do behind the scenes. And last not the least, the participants who actually join us with us for every session and enlighten with their questions and also make the sessions more interesting. So thank you so much for that. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Niharika ji. Niharika ji is a doctoral scholar at the institute. She's working on Kashmir Shaivism. And ma'am, over to you for the final comments.
Thank you, Preet. I was just wondering after listening to Madhavji that often destiny and human efforts play together. So that's why some efforts of organizing this series and the destiny that the Guru Shishya Parambara themselves, become a part of the series. So that's amazing. So I guess we all just experienced a very beautiful, elaborate, and so systematic study of the text and the tradition. And I think we need many more hours, perhaps, to listen to Professor Mark McClish. And we personally thank him on behalf of this institute, National Institute of Advanced Studies, and all the audience, all my colleagues here. And we are really hoping we can listen to you again. And this is just a beginning. And I also wanted to just make a small mention that we have 3 more lectures to go in this series. And that's from Amba Kulkarni, Stephen Phillips, and Arindam Chakrabarti. These 3 are the lectures which are pending. And with that, this series will be over. Our idea in presenting this series on Sanskrit and its tradition and its history, by presenting it in a contemporaneity, the context of contemporaneity, is that we all engage with the topic that is still alive and perhaps is very much exciting for all of us to learn from very different perspectives and disciplines. And we have had very over-enthusiastically, overwhelming, I should say, responses. We started this series and still we have this enthusiasm continuing. Our YouTube videos are being seen in thousands. Madhavji's lectures have crossed, I think, some 2,000, one of his lectures views. So it's very, very enthusiastic response. And these are all free lectures and everybody is free to learn them, listen to the YouTube lecture and contact the speakers. We are also documenting the question answers as Preet said, and also sharing it with others. We also will again share it with you in case you have not received that document. So in case any one of you are interested to support our activities by any way, I mean, maybe perhaps by an idea or perhaps your suggestion or any way you think our young scholars, the topics which we are interested will get a boost by your support, please do write to us at NIAS Consciousness Program at nias.res.in or to any one of us. Your support is very valuable for us to continue this tradition of offering our services freely in the contemporary context, I think, because that's something which is very important, that in the pandemic times, all that which we can do is to share with each other and to share our happiness and perhaps from that nourish each one of us. So my request is to let us know if you have an idea, a suggestion, or any other form of support which you wish to offer for our program and our activities coming. I'm sorry for taking that long time, but I thought we should mention that. Thank you, Preet.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think with this, we will wind the session. Any comment from Professor Mark, sir, or are we good to wind the session?
Oh, no, I just thank you greatly all for attending and for your questions and for the opportunity to put this into a forum for a broader but highly educated audience, and then to make it available, as Dr. Menon just said, to a wider audience. It's a gratifying feeling, and I'm humbled and honored. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, one and all. Namaste.